Welcome to the Critical Therapy Antidote podcast.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Critical Therapy Antidote podcast. From Michael and myself, we are very privileged to have Ryan Rogers as our guest today. Ryan is a counselor. He's just enrolled or is doing his practicum in counseling psychology. And the reason for our interview today is we would like to explore his own experiences going through the counseling programs and what he's encountered, specifically the theme of critical therapy antidote, the politicization of the mental health field. Welcome, Ryan.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So maybe you can give us a bit of a background. You've done your undergraduate studies. You've done the theory part, M1 for your master's program. Maybe you can elaborate a bit more on where you're from, what have your experiences been like in this program?
Yeah, so I've lived basically all my life in Texas, and my personal background and my work background are in addiction treatment. So I've had to overcome alcohol and drugs on a personal level, and I've worked with a lot of people very closely on helping them, gain sobriety and overcome that. And during that journey, I've seen a lot of people, especially several of my close friends, pass away from heroin and fentanyl overdose or suicide. And that's kind of what motivated me to become a therapist, is that was my way to fight back against something that was, very painful and deeply personal to me. I assumed that kind of everyone was going to have a similar level of dedication, I guess. And that's not what I found in graduate school. I learned a lot in my first week, really. The first week really sets the tone in graduate school. You start off class by announcing your pronouns. You do a privilege walk. In my first semester, there was a course called Counseling the Culturally Diverse. And my professor said that one of your primary objectives as a therapist. So my professor for my Counseling the Culturally Diverse class said one of your primary objectives as a therapist is to become a political activist so that you can, quote, burn it all to the ground. And I'm thinking I actually have a background in radical left-wing politics. I was a big Bernie Sanders supporter. I was a radical socialist. I was ready to burn it all to the ground for a long time. And I realized I wasn't making the world a better place. I was just making myself more angry and bitter and depressed. And so I decided that the way I was going to make the world better was through therapy, helping people one-on-one, one at a time. And I actually went to my professor's office. I said, this really kind of bothers me. I was like, this is not why I came to graduate school. I don't want to become a political activist. I don't want to burn anything to the ground. I want to help people with their mental health one-on-one. And she said explicitly, she said, that's too bad. If you want to be a counselor, you have to be a political activist, period. There is no alternative. And that was just very shocking to me that that's such a central aspect of the field. And there's really, just no getting around it. It's not really ambiguous in any sense. It's not like they're kind of flirt with it or being vague. Like they're very clear and upfront, like we are political activists, period.
And when you entered this program, did you know that your course was going to be this woke?
No, I mean,
Okay.
I feel bad. Perhaps I was vague, or perhaps I was naive. I don't know, but
Mm.
I saw, kind of a multicultural counseling class, and I thought, oh, that's wonderful. I could really benefit to learn about other cultures that I might be counseling. And it really, there's virtually zero knowledge or information that they give you about other cultures. It's you need to adopt left-wing politics. And I would sit on
Mhm.
the front row. I'd have my hand raised how would you counsel a Latina woman with anxiety? I'm asking questions, and every single question, the answer is, we're not going to get to that today. The point is, you need to have far left-wing politics. We're not really interested in if you know how to counsel a black man with autism. Like that's not really relevant here. The actual multiculturalism is not a central piece of this story. The politics is the central piece.
Mhm.
Almost like a bait and switch tactic.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
What's on the wrapper is not really what's inside the box.
Yes, yes.
All right. And by that time, would you say that, or at that time, what was your political leaning when you entered
Um,
this,
it,
or
it's it,
philosophical leaning? Mm.
I like to joke that I was, probably a little to the left of Karl Marx when I came back to academia, and I'm pretty
Hmm.
centrist now. I feel like every day that I spend in academia, I keep getting more right wing. I'm pretty center, like kind of a classical liberal. And I guess at the time, I thought of myself as a progressive liberal. And the more I experience this stuff, the less I want of it, I guess.
What do you
That's
think it was
interesting.
about running up against? Because, many of these ideas, the critical social justice ideas that people run into in schools, they come from some permutation of a Marxist tradition. And so I'm hearing you say that you had this kind of this background with the leftist frame, let's say, and now you're running up against this kind of the modern advent of that. And now you're, contrasting it. You're saying now I find myself, moving to the right almost by contrast. I mean, what was that like for you to run up against these ideas in this form where you're saying, I'm coming back because I genuinely want to help people as a therapist. And you're being told in no uncertain terms that, no, you're not here to be a therapist. You're more here to be an activist. I mean, I'm just trying to reconcile with what that must
Yeah.
have felt like.
Freud has this quote that eventually we all run into the brick wall of reality.
Mm,
And I feel like that was kind of true of me in the sense that it's really nice to have a lot of these high-minded ideas of what should a utopian society look like and this and that. That's nice to think about, and philosophize in a freshman dorm room or something. But this is actually more, hard, like applicable stuff that we really need to be focusing on. And in my
hmm
background with addiction, um, either someone's overdosing from fentanyl or they're not. Either there's a suicide or there's not. It doesn't really matter how nice sounding your ideas are. And if your solution to, you're going to help your clients get sober by promising that you're going to devote yourself to overthrowing the capitalist system or, dismantling patriarchy in some kind of vague, ambiguous way, that's not actually helping people in any meaningful way. And people are suffering a lot. And it really just rubs me the wrong way when I see this. And it's like, that's wonderful that you have, no background in economics or political science, but you're convinced you can fix the world, but you are supposed to be a counselor and you can't tell me about that.
Yeah.
mm-hmm.
And I don't know what it's like there in the States. The training that some of the counselors and psychologists are getting in South Africa, that's where I trained. Stats wasn't that wasn't that high on the menu for many of them to take. And yet they try to be the experts in economics. But I want to ask you something else. So when you started, it sounds to me like philosophically or politically, you were almost aligned with what the university had to offer.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And then something, or then things gradually happened for you.
Mm, I would say the shift probably started with my undergrad.
Oh,
I had dropped out of my bachelor's many years ago because of my addiction issues, and I went back in 2020 to finish. And with 2020, there was kind of a woke explosion. And
hmm
my student job was at the Addiction Recovery Center, and there were several instances. I remember one was the director of the Addiction Recovery Center, and this was at Baylor University, which is a Christian school in the heart of Texas. The director of the Addiction Recovery Center said, one of our primary objectives going forward is to decenter white men. And I'm thinking, like, what in the world does that mean? And why is that? How does that help us with addiction?
hmm
And I remember kind of my breaking point at the Addiction Recovery Center was our chaplain, our chaplain, who's supposed to be like a spiritual advisor to the students, was using our social media channels to promote a Planned Parenthood rally. And I came to the director and I was like, look, I don't really have a dog in this fight. I'm not trying to get into the abortion debate or anything, but we have conservative students who come here. I feel like we're alienating them. We're not really representing them properly by, explicitly pushing this political agenda. And her words to me were so powerful. She said, the boat is only so big, we can't save everyone.
Yeah.
And in other words, like, the politically radical students are worth our time to try to save. And if you're a conservative or even a moderate, you're not really worth our time, essentially. And, so I was already kind of rubbed the wrong way by this kind of dichotomy between, these high-minded left-wing ideals and actually doing serious work to help people who are suffering. The whole kind of left-wing philosophy is we're doing this because we're helping people who are suffering. And I'm seeing kind of a breakdown where it's like you're ignoring people who are suffering so that you can push your ideas. So I'm already starting to kind of, the wheels are turning, and I get into graduate school, and so much of it just seemed, I guess I started to dislike the ideas on principle, but so much of it seemed like a theatrical performance. The privilege walks, the saying pronouns, policing each other's microaggressions. It just seemed like the students who get master's degrees tend to be very privileged, and it's like the most privileged people on earth who are just paranoid about being oppressed. And it really just kind of coming from my background and seeing people with drug addiction, people dealing with homelessness and severe mental illness, to see these very privileged people kind of put on this grand performance as though they're marginalized people, it did kind of rub me the wrong way.
Mm. And so even in your career before coming back to school, you're kind of seeing something of that performative melodrama take place in the workspace. You're wondering, how does this really, in terms of practical application, help clients across the board? And it sounds like from what you experienced, you're getting the feedback that, hey, okay, no, only some people are the people that we want to help. It's like this selective orientation towards healing and worthiness to get on the quote unquote boat. I'm imagining kind of the arc. Who do we want to kind of,
Yeah,
in
yeah.
some sense, have couple on and reproduce in some sense from a political standpoint, and just making sure that everybody else is just completely off ship. And then you get to school and you're seeing this performative element, drum up and grow and exacerbate across time, and it's getting more and more pronounced. I mean, what kind of things you're talking about the privileged walk? What kind of things were you seeing, across your coursework?
There was a lot, the most notable came from the Counseling the Culturally Diverse class, and that was written by Daryl Wing Sue and some other
Mhm.
people. And it's just, I like to joke. I don't know if it was written by critical race theorists or Richard Spencer, the famous white supremacist, because there's so many things in the book that are just jarring. There's obviously like this kind of demonization of white people that's pretty heavy-handed. But the way they treat minorities it seemed disgusting to me. There was kind of this constant implication that especially black clients are not intelligent enough to handle rationality-oriented therapies like CBT or insight-oriented therapies like psychodynamic. There's kind of this implication that they're essentially not smart enough to handle these type of therapies.
Mm.
And I've worked with a number of black clients over the years, and I've never thought, this client is not smart enough to handle, what kind of treatment we're giving them. So it seems bizarre. First of all, it seems really degrading. So I really just I find that type of curriculum really offensive. Um, there's other stuff, I don't know if you're familiar, I'm sure you are, with like the WPATH files and the CAS report.
Mhm.
There's a lot of evidence, a tremendous amount of evidence in over the last year showing that gender affirming care for minors is incredibly harmful. It is not evidence-based. The evidence is coming in just in droves. And every single professor I've had has said that gender affirming care is the only appropriate way to treat gender confused minors.
Mm.
And there's this one telling example in class. A woman raised her hand. She goes, "Well, what if a child changes their mind later on?" And the professor goes, "Huh, I've never thought about that."
Mm.
Like so many of the ideas that are pushed in graduate school, it's like this is the correct answer, but you don't even
Mhm.
really know what the issue is.
Yeah.
You know what the
Be-
correct answer is, but you don't know
yeah.
what the issue is.
Yeah.
Before we started our recording, Michael and I were just chatting about this. Um, the impression I got that many years ago, when psychologists and counselors were trained, I get the sense that they were invited to really apply their minds and to really add to discussions and add to the field and with their formulations, with their understandings, with really trying different angles of viewing things. There was truly this seriousness around psychology and psychotherapy with one aim, and that is to, number one, improve. It's like any skill with any type of science, to advance the field and to try and help people and be better at helping people. But these days, the impression I get is, according to these institutions, the best trainees are the ones who could memorize and obey orthodoxy, the catechisms, the best. And the most virtuous ones are the ones that could just, run down lists of what they're supposed to do, and, having the right language, saying the name drops, saying the right things in terms of critical social justice, almost displaying their virtue in that way, the best. And that is what earns them, the biggest and the best accolades. Has that been your experience too?
Yeah, I mean, even in classes where critical social justice is not, a key component of the class,
Yeah.
I like to say that the social justice hangs in the air. Like it's always kind of thick in the atmosphere, even if it's not directly spoken. Like it's there, and a big part of critical social justice is very similar to a fanatical religion in that you gain credibility with other members by calling out heretics or banishing heretics. So any infraction or microaggression or things like that, if you call that out, that looks very good. It makes you look very virtuous and very righteous, right? And there's one example, there's tons of examples, but there's one example. There was a man and a woman in one of my classes talking before class. I don't remember the exact nature of the conversation, but the man said, I heard they buried the hatchet. And the woman said,
Mm.
Oh, you shouldn't say that. That's cultural appropriation of the Native Americans. And I'm thinking like, if you look in the Gerald Wing Sue book under the definition and examples of microaggressions, it's so vague and so ambiguous and so subjective that literally anything that you say could theoretically be a microaggression, could be offensive, racist, sexist, homophobic in some way. And so it's almost like dealer's choice. Like, do I want to call you a racist or not?
Mm.
And you're just constantly walking through this field of landmines, and it's impossible to know where they are. It's impossible to
Mhm.
memorize everything that could theoretically be offensive. And so I think a lot of people just kind of keep their mouths shut most of the time.
Yeah.
Mm.
When you said that there's this critical social justice thing hanging in the air, it's almost like Big Brother's watching all the time. It's also almost
Mm.
like you're in woke North Korea. Everybody is aware that they're being watched. Everybody needs to view things a certain way, and everybody tries to undo or outperform the other person in being this virtuous and moral agent, and to call them out, right? There's this almost this moral competition. How woke can you be?
It's kind of interesting because most of the enforcement does not come from professors.
Yeah.
Mm.
Professors set the tone very early in the first couple weeks of classes. We're saying our pronouns, we're doing our privilege walks. We want to let you know we're devoted to diversity and social justice. They like set this tone very heavy-handed the first couple weeks, and then they basically let the students take over. And then the
Mm.
students police the boundaries for the rest of the semester.
Mhm, mhm. Ryan, when I recently was talking with a colleague and trying to explain, I received my training during this era, let's say, the woke era.
Hmm.
And what I came to realize after reflection, after some time, was that the thing that really got me was kind of what you're describing right now, which is not the explicit statements that came up, which did come up depending on the professor, but it was the implicit supposition that the moral norms of the group had already been set in advance, and that omnipresence, that feeling of tension in the room of who's part of that in group and who's part of that out group. How do I discern what's safe for me to say and what's not safe for me to say? And I'm wondering, within that tension for myself, there was quite a bit of anxiety provoked on a regular basis. I'm wondering what it's like to be in that setting for you, from your perspective, to to be in that atmosphere, so to speak. I mean, how are you making sense of it in the moment, and what is it feeling like for you?
Someone asked me the other day, like, do you ever question gender affirming care in class? Or do you ever question critical race theory? And I think what I would say to that is the boundaries are drawn in such a way that you would never even get close to that. Like they let you know that like a mile away from that is unacceptable. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so you have to choose your words very carefully. I remember I was in a group project with this guy. He was ex-military. You know, the ex-military guys that I've met seem to have a much more level-headed, good head on their shoulders. They seem more rational, seem more pragmatic. He's ex-military, and he had background working in the mental health field. And we're doing this group project, and if you even begin to question things, you can't just come out and say it. It's like you have to give a little, they give a little. You're kind of testing the waters a little bit to see, can I really say this? How cool are you? You know what I mean? And at one point, he leans in. We're at a coffee shop, not on campus.
Hmm.
We're at a coffee shop, and he leans in and said, "Look, man, I got 3 kids. I'm not okay with transitioning kids.
Hmm.
You would never say that on campus. You would never come close to that. But there's some people like off campus in a hushed voice, you could say that. So when you get,
Hmm.
on campus, you think, what is the most acceptable way that I can challenge orthodoxy? And I remember there's one time in my marriage and family counseling class, I thought every day I'm going to push back just a little bit, just once, you
Hmm.
know. And in this class, the point that I tried to make was sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes objective reality is a useful concept in therapy. And there were several people who act like I had just kicked a puppy or something.
Hmm.
It was like considered a horribly offensive thing that objective reality might even be like a knowable thing, like a real thing. But there was one woman after class, she goes, "You really had me thinking about that. Like, I wonder if that's, kind of." And so, some people are asking questions, but there's certain things like that. Another one is, the book The Ethical Slut, which
Oh
was a
yeah.
book that I had to read for marriage and family therapy. And the correct answer is that if you are still believing in monogamy, you are married to these outdated puritanical norms of Christianity, that you need to essentially grow up and evolve past your jealousy and kind of grow into this kind of higher evolved form of polyamory. That's essentially what the message is. And there was this one probably 25-year-old woman. She's just wrestling with it because she knows that's the correct answer, and she goes, but I don't want to share my boyfriend. You have people that are like questioning and pushing back, but it's so hard because like the idea of what the correct answer is just so thick in the air.
And isn't
Hmm.
it
Hmm.
interesting? It is precisely these types of influences that cripple certain vulnerable communities. And when these vulnerable communities are crippled, they use their crippled and decrepit state to weaponize their resentment against the West. You get what I'm saying? They
Mhm.
give the poison. The poison produces the death, but they don't blame the poison for the death. They blame the convenient enemy, the convenient scapegoat. Because we know that certain communities in America, even in South Africa, but in America, are battling. And we know that if we did a proper sociological assessment of it, there would be certain factors that have directly contributed to the crippling of those communities, such as deteriorating institutions in those areas, uh, rampant crime, poor policing, poor clamping down on drug distribution, drug use, and the big clanger is the disintegration of the nuclear family, fatherless boys, for instance. And isn't it interesting now where things like the ethical slut is prescribed? And if you were counseling someone in front of you, you wouldn't even, and if you bought into this ethical slut doctrine, you wouldn't even question their family environment as a possible contributing factor to their psychological suffering, because that has just been sacralized,
Hmm.
right? So
Hmm.
it made me wonder, seeing that there are seeing that there are proper ways of doing counseling and there are woke ways of doing counseling. According to your training, what does healing look like then?
You know, um, Gosh, that's a tough question.
according to the wokeists. Now,
Yeah, I think there's a mindset, and I want to touch on all of what you just said there.
all right,
So
go for it.
there's a mindset where if you have a heterosexual, middle class, white male client, therapy in and of itself can be very beneficial. You can talk through these issues because that person, their issues are all in their head, basically. So you can kind of talk through their issues, essentially. If you have a client who's a racial minority, a sexual minority, a woman, anything like that, one-on-one counseling in the therapy office is going to have marginal effect at best. You're going to be tinkering around the edges because that person's real issue is structural and institutional, systemic racism, patriarchy, capitalism. These type of things are what's actually holding this person down. So what you should focus on instead is advocacy, becoming a political activist, right? And what I think is really interesting and actually very perverse, if I have two clients, one's a white guy and one's a black guy, and let's say they both come to me with some combination of depression and anxiety. And I look up, in my textbook, okay, what's best to handle combination depression, anxiety? Let's, do some cognitive behavioral therapy. That's considered the gold standard by a lot of people, not everyone. A lot of people consider that the gold standard of treatment. And what my classes would tell me is that's fine for the white guy, but you have to essentially give some type of subpar, according to the evidence, a subpar treatment to the black client, right? So, like, you look at these things, you talked about the nuclear family. You could also talk about internal versus external locus of control, like believing that I have control over my life, taking personal responsibility, having some type of work ethic, like taking value in your life, and like all these type of things that you would say for this white guy, this heterosexual middle class white guy, we know for a fact this is lifting him out of troubling life circumstances, lifting out of poverty. Like we know for a fact these things are beneficial. But for this black client, we're saying, no, those are symptoms of white supremacy. These are not for you. These tools that could help you lift you up in your life, these are not for you, right? That's essentially what we're saying.
And so it sounds like the way that they were describing it is that for white clients, what they're experiencing is totally internally mediated. They have the ability to get a benefit out of one of our forms of therapy, whatever the theoretical orientation might be. But for our black clients, or clients of color, they don't have access to it's not that they have an internal issue that they're trying to work through. It's that there are these external factors that are oppressing them and precluding them from reaching any form of healing. And it kind of reminded me of something that I remember a professor kind of throwing out in a class once about the idea between black emotions and white emotions. I remember sitting there in awe at this concept of trying to separate, almost speciate the emotional experience of human beings across identity characteristics. And you sit there in awe, your jaw unhinges a little bit, but you have to keep your mouth shut and eyes forward while these things are happening. At least that was my experience. And it makes me wonder, what do you think that is predicated on, that belief that there's somehow this speciation in emotional experience between different groups?
It's absolutely bizarre. I remember in the Daryl Wing Sue book, there's a section that says if a black client is happy and does not see themselves as oppressed, they're suffering from Uncle Tom syndrome. Like, this idea that it's almost like, racial minorities are beings from another world, like they're aliens or something. The way they treat, this is not so different from how kind of, segregationist thinking was. The black people and the white people are not like each other, and then you had this brief moment during the civil rights era. Is that, I remember in one of MLK's marches, the men wore a sign that said, "I'm a man." Like, I am a man just like you. I want to work. I want to feed my family. Like, we have the same fundamental drives and desires. And, we have the same common humanity. That was a big part of MLK's civil rights movement. And now we've gone back essentially to saying, no, these are basically different species. And it seems, I don't know, it seems hard for me to differentiate between racism and anti-racism. And the best way you can tell is just who's saying it, I guess, is the only difference.
Who's
Yeah,
saying it?
yeah.
Because it's the difference between a biologically deterministic argument when you're talking about it from a biological lens to a socially deterministic argument
Mm,
of saying, well, you still have the same vulnerabilities and still have the same deficits, but we're gonna correlate that to a social narrative as opposed to
mm,
what's truly internal to you. It still puts an individual at odds with their environment and at odds with the ability to adapt and to uh, become to flourish in their
Mm.
life. It seems like the exact same argument, just the other side of the spectrum.
yeah, yeah, very true.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
Because I think John McWhorter would say anti-racism is just a kind of racism. It's
Mm,
woke racism, but it's racism by any other name. So now I'm really trying to figure this out. So so there would be this person of some minority in front of you, and you would explore their minority status, and then what? So you would really inculcate in their awareness that society has actually turned against them, and they're a minority, and that they're being victimized. So how does healing work then? I'm really trying to figure this
Mhm.
out. So, no one's been able to explain this to me. They would tell me that that is what they're supposed to do. Um, so you build resentment,
yeah.
and right, you would induce a lot of resentment in the person, and then
It's almost like kind of a bizarre form of insight-oriented therapy where, there might be some level of relief in discovering the true nature of the world, and the true nature of the world is that I'm a victim of the patriarchy or cis heteronormativity or capitalism or what have you. Like there's like this almost like a bizarre form of psychoanalysis where it's like, now I truly understand why I'm feeling depression and anxiety, and it's because, of Jeff Bezos having so much money or something like that. Um, but you don't have like full remission of symptoms until you do the political work, until we overthrow the capitalist system and the patriarchy and this and that, right?
I
Like
see.
that's, you could never be fully like healed, so to speak, until we overthrow those systems and structures that are, so oppressive.
I see.
Mhm.
So then their distress becomes displaced, where the course of healing would involve activism, rebellion, subverting systems. So psychotherapy really becomes a radicalization process.
Mhm.
Does
Yeah.
do I
Yeah.
understand it correctly?
Yes. Yes.
And you make them more and more militant?
I think that's the goal. I mean, again,
Yeah,
when I say this, I think a lot of therapists, even if they're like casually woke, I don't think their goal is necessarily to make their clients militant activists. It's kind of like any religion, I guess. There's Christians who just show up on Christmas and Easter, and there's Christians who go to mass every day, right? And it's the same thing with wokeness. I think a lot of therapists who are casually woke, they're also generally devoted to making sure their clients achieve some degree of well-being. You know what I
Mhm.
mean?
Mhm.
And there's some people, especially like your activists who are in academia, the type of people who are professors in these type of programs, the political aspect is number one, front and center at all times.
yeah,
Mhm. It sounds like almost like you're kind of setting up a spectrum of the
Yeah.
cultural adherents versus the cultural rhetoricians versus the fervent activist who's like, you know what, my job is to raise the saliency of your identity so that we can essentially, and that's not the way they're thinking about it, but from my view, lead to some form of inception of a core pain that maybe wasn't even there previously. Taking a vulnerable individual and dropping a kernel into their life and watching it grow, and then saying at the same time, it's like a snake oil salesman. You release the snake, and then you also say, well, here's the way that you can deal with it. Here's the snake oil to make sure that it goes away. We need to increase racial saliency. We need to increase the saliency of your identity, and then we need to start working on the social structures around you to, uh, in some vague sense, remediate the oppressive structures around you so that you yourself feel better. While at the same time, I'm hearing that spectrum that you're making of, generally speaking, if somebody goes into these settings, they're not really given a very descriptive set of interventions, if you will, to engage in. But what is it that they're telling you at bare minimum, to start with? I know I raised the racial saliency issue, just a moment ago, but it sounds like to me you're describing the difference between somebody who's going in and says, I have a full-scale approach, a manualized approach to getting this person into activist status, versus people who are just kind of sipping the Kool-Aid instead of taking a full drink, who are going in with these ideas of, I need to at least drop these little things in to make sure that I'm doing my due diligence as a social justice advocate, something along those lines.
That's a really tough question to answer. Like, what do you actually want? Because I'm
Hmm.
not sure that question really gets answered very clearly. I
Hmm.
know I'm supposed to be very angry, and I know I'm supposed to have far left-wing politics, but it's pretty vague beyond that. I remember my counseling the culturally diverse class. The professor goes over this example where a white male therapist kind of bumbles a session with a Latina woman with anxiety, right?
Hmm.
And I raised my hand, and the point of the example is, white men do it wrong, and you need to have left-wing politics. That's the point of every example, right? And so I raised my hand. And I said, okay, I get it. Like, I'm a white guy here. I know I'm inexperienced. I'm probably going to do a lot of things wrong. How would you appropriately counsel this person? And she said, we're not going to cover that today. And then she broke us into small groups to talk about, privilege or something like that. And there's two women in my group. One was from Mexico. One, her parents were from Mexico. And I said, hey, can y'all help me out? Like, I don't understand, like, because anxiety has specific manifestations in Latino women, and we're not learning anything about it. I said, can y'all explain this to me? And for the next 20 minutes, they go into detailed explanation of what that looks like. In that 20 minutes, I learned more about multiculturalism than in 2 years of the program, even though we say multiculturalism all the time, right? So there's this idea of, you're kind of talking around these issues. I know that oppression and privilege are huge, and the answer to this is somehow voting blue. I know that's somehow part of the equation. We get that stressed a lot, but what exactly do you do when you're sitting in a session with a client? Like, what happens there? There's far less focus on that.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So multiculturalism is actually just a course in identity stereotyping,
Yeah,
right? Superficial identity.
yeah.
Because I've also had the experience. She's a very good, not very good, but a decent friend of mine who's from a Caribbean origin, and she went to South Africa, and for a time we worked together, but for a very, very, very short time. And even though superficially, because she had dark skin and superficially she looked like some of my other African colleagues, one would, according to the Americanism, this identity politics, one would imagine that they would be the same, because that is what identity politics tells you, right? They're the same based on skin color. And she wasn't a very good fit. And some of the South African white practitioners and the African practitioners were very good fits, precisely because of this thing about cultural understanding. That you cannot just go on superficial tags to determine whether a person has a common experience, or two people would have a common experience. Because according to identity politics, I wasn't supposed to fit nicely into a predominantly African space, but it is possible. Identity politics does not adequately account for the reality and realities around human interaction. It
I think
just doesn't.
Yeah, I think if you were to take intersectionality to its logical conclusion, you would take every factor imaginable about that person into consideration to the point that you looked at them like an individual, right? But
Hmm.
I think the flaw of intersectionality is it's very shallow. It's like maybe
Hmm.
three things: your race, gender, and sexual orientation, or something like that. Like
Yeah.
that's all very surface level stuff that it takes into account for you. But I think if you were to truly apply that principle, it's like, okay, what is everything about you? And let's apply all of that and kind of look at you in a holistic way.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, it
Yeah.
creates apertures by which to understand the client, but it doesn't in any way actually create a door for you to explore with them. Something you said earlier that I thought was interesting was in your earlier career experiences, you were noticing this, well, throughout your experience so far, it sounds like this negation or this rejection or almost this disgust, if I'm picking up correctly, towards anything on the right side of the political spectrum. And
Yeah.
I was hoping you could speak a little bit more to that because, I've certainly seen that in my career so far where, I've definitely had an experience, at least one experience where I tried to refer a client out. And the reason that I was told I couldn't refer the client wasn't because of the acuity of presentation, wasn't anything along those lines, which I would understand if somebody felt they couldn't give somebody the care they needed. But it was related to the conservative leanings of that client. And I remember sitting there going, okay, this is what I've been worried about for years, that somebody's going to you know, do harm to somebody based on their political identity, let's say, which seems to be a very salient element of this. There's the sociocultural elements of this that bleed both into the the identities that are in the intersectionality approach, let's just say. And then there's this other category of people, which is a larger swath of people, technically, if you look at it through this lens, that are completely being disregarded, if not being told they're not worthy of care as well. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to that experience within your schooling, but also just generally in the field.
Yeah, I mean, there's tons of examples of
Where
what
do
you're
we
talking
start?
about.
Right,
Yeah,
right,
where do you
right.
start? The first thing I'll say is that words like conservative, right wing, Republican, or Trump supporter, those don't necessarily have any connection to actual politics. They're
Mm,
they're generally just shorthand for bad.
mm,
Right. It's just, that's a conservative idea. It doesn't matter if it came from the Republican Party or some right-wing thinker. It's like, it's just, I don't like that. It's conservative. Like, it's just a
mhm,
shorthand for bad. There's one example I'm thinking of. I forget which class this was, but the professor broke us out into small groups. And the breakout question we were discussing, this is not an exaggeration. This is literally our breakout question. He said, how are you going to be a social justice warrior for counseling? That was our question. And there was a younger woman, probably 20s, in my group, and she said, "Oh, well, I'm just going to vote like my clients would want me to vote." And I said, "How do you know how your clients would want you to vote?" And there's like this look of shock on her face. And she
mhm,
goes, "What if I get a Trump supporter as a client?" And it's like that's considered like icky. Like
mhm,
there's a like a visceral disgust response when thinking about a conservative or a Trump supporter. It's like we're taught to embrace and almost put on this sacred pedestal any possible combination of, you know, disabled, transgender, Pacific Islander, like any combination you could think of is holy and sacred and elevated. But like the 70 plus million people who voted for Donald Trump are essentially like subhuman scum. And
mhm.
that attitude is just so pervasive, like in my school, but also from what I've seen, like more broadly in the profession.
Hmm. It reminds me of a couple of years ago when the research was starting to come out on the notion of Trump anxiety, which I think colloquially is often referred to, or at least similarly, as like Trump derangement syndrome, where it's
Mhm.
this high degree of anxious affect related to anything that even resembles Trump or the Conservative Party. And it's interesting because most of the research on political discourse in psychotherapy so far is suggesting that most therapists run into political dialogue, some 80+% in some studies, run into political dialogue at some point in their career. And if you're completely being indoctrinated into one way, you could almost think of a political lens as being a moral lens by which you understand reality and by which you constitute goodness and badness to some degree. If they're all being pushed in one direction, what are they supposed to do when they actually come up against that variation of political thought and belief? Um, how do they actually approach that?
You brought up the example of the Ark or like Noah's Ark.
Mm-hmm,
And my old boss who had said the boat's only so big, we can only save so many people. And you essentially make this moral judgment. Like we're going to focus on saving the good people, the right people, the people who have the correct political views, and the people who have the icky political views who those are really not our people that we need to focus on. Like if they were worth saving, they'd be smart enough and moral enough to hold the correct political views, is essentially the attitude.
if they were righteous enough, then they would be able to come
Yes.
in here and
Yes.
benefit from the work. So it's almost, I mean, if you contrast it with the notion of black versus white emotions, just to make it simplistic,
Mhm.
it's red versus blue emotions that are coming in here, a red versus blue level of virtuosity in terms of
Mm.
what we can treat and what is worthy of treatment, who is worthy of treatment at the end
Yeah.
of the day, if I'm hearing you right.
It's not like it's not like a minor thing either. It's not like, hey, we have different opinions on this, and I think yours would lead to less efficient outcomes, or the outcomes you're pursuing might be counterproductive to what I want. It's not like an intellectual critique like that. It's like you voted for Donald Trump, therefore you are morally depraved. You are an irredeemable sinner, and I cannot have my therapy office tainted with your presence, essentially.
Mm, hmm
So let's do a bit of an intellectual investigation of this then. And if I may, could would it be possible for you to perhaps reflect on your own psychology? You said earlier that you were rather left-leaning at one point, and you also had your own journey, as I'm sure Michael also has. Um, and I've had my journey. Um, would you say that there was a sort of a link between certain psychological states or psychological leanings and, in your case, political leanings?
100%.
Okay.
I guess I can be a little bit vulnerable here. I've talked about this before on another podcast, but 2015 was the year that I really became radicalized as a lefty.
mm,
I had had some pre-existing depression. I had had a romantic breakup. Three of my closest friends had died to heroin overdoses. I lost a job. Like a lot was going wrong around that time. And I discovered Bernie Sanders, and I immediately shot way past that. Bernie Sanders was like the furthest to the right I was willing to go. I was, very radical socialist, and I continually bombarded my brain with messaging of how terrible the world is. Capitalism is oppressing us. We live in a systemically racist country. We're all about to die any moment from climate change, all this stuff. And that just sent my depression in a spiral, right?
mm,
And I had two suicide attempts in 2015. And one of the common, first of all, there was the how bad everything is, which I was dramatically exaggerating because of how I filtered my media consumption. But the other was climate change was a really big thing for me. And just by my existing, I'm taking up resources that are, increasing carbon output. I am killing the planet. I am murdering humanity just by existing. I'm absorbing that message, and it keeps going deeper and deeper. I thought like it is immoral for me to continue living was the message I was getting. And after that, for a number of years, I'm just in this dark, depressed place. Everything is terrible, and I'm constantly reinforcing that message with my social media and media consumption. Um, I'm getting into activism, and the world is so terrible, capitalism so oppressive, all that just running through my mind constantly. And I remember I went back to school to become a therapist around the same time that the 2020 election. So Bernie had lost. So I devoted myself to this for like 5+ years. And I'm clearly not changing the world for the better by my political activism. I'm having no effect. The only effect I'm having on the world is to become sad and angry and bitter and resentful. Like I'm hurting my own mental health, but I'm not having any effect on the world. And so the first thing I did was I got off of social media for a while, for like 3 years. So I got off of social media, and within 30 days, it was like a night and day change in my mental health. I started becoming less politically radical. My depression started to lift, anxiety started to lift. I started focusing on like how I can affect the actual world around me instead of worrying about, what's going on in Congress and whether that's, having my happiness dependent on what happens in Washington, D.C. or what have you. And it was such a quick turnaround when my politics started to become more moderate and my depression started to lift. And I started to become genuinely happy after that when I was, devoted to how can I pour into the people around me and, invest in my own life instead of, stuff that's happening out there that I have no control over.
You said that you were also or you are also in recovery, and I don't know if you've come across this expression of it's an expression used by the people of Narcotics Anonymous where they say live life on life's terms.
Yeah, yeah.
Would you say that that might have been a bit of a hangover from this protest against life, protest against living life on life's terms, that it could have been translated into some political activism as in protest against some more legitimate sounding, legitimate appearing representation of life, namely capitalism, etc.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, there was refusing to accept that the girlfriend had left me, refusing to accept that my friends had died, that, certain choices that I had made had led to me failing out of school or losing certain jobs, refusing to accept those things, just kind of putting on blinders and saying, like, it's the capitalist system, it's Citizens United, it's the billionaires. That's why I'm suffering, refusing to actually look at my part in those things. And in Alcoholics Anonymous 12-step fellowships, steps 4 and 5, a big part of that is look at myself. What is my part? How have I continued my own troubles?
Right. It's very self-empowering.
Yeah. That's another thing is, what I want my therapy as personally as a therapist to be is to be empowering to clients. And I feel like giving them tools to make their lives better, and one of those being personal responsibility, I feel like that's very empowering to people. And everybody I've worked with, in the addiction treatment space and 12-step sponsees, everybody I've worked with is so grateful to have tools that empower them. And it seems like the message that I get from graduate school is you really need to be pushing this disempowering message of victimhood, which is kind of the opposite of what I see as being helpful.
And what I found really interesting, if I may go back for a moment, is that you were describing while you were in a very vulnerable state, dealing with loss, dealing with addiction, that you were kind of imbibing this explanatory narrative that potentially could give you a way of making sense of what you're going through, but it's an externalizing narrative. It's focusing on the world. It's very existential in some sense. I often think this with, the eco-anxiety claims of you're focusing on something that's completely out of your control. It's divorced from you in some sense, and yet all of your attention's being put there. It sounds so similar to what you're describing as when you went to school and they're talking about working with racial minorities or people from different intersectional backgrounds, let's just say, and externalizing their experience. It sounds to me that you very much had a personal experience of what something like that tastes like, feels like, and the kinds of avenues that you could go down, whether it's social media or just in terms of self-blame. I'm seeing where you almost, in some sense, um, through that, and I wonder if this is me reaching a little bit, developed almost an immune system, a psychic immune system to something like that, where you go, I've been through that. I've
Yeah.
been bitten by the snake. I know exactly where that leads. Do you feel like that had like a direct causal role in your ability to recognize this when you did go back to school as going, man, this doesn't work?
Absolutely. And there is a payoff to it as
Mm,
well.
mm,
Like there's this when you get this aha moment, I understand how the world really works. And I'm
mm.
one of few people who really understand the way the world really works, right?
Special knowledge.
I
Hmm.
have this kind of self-righteous sense of superiority. There's the special knowledge I have,
Hmm.
I might not have gone to Harvard, but I really get it and you don't kind
Hmm.
of thing. I might not have lived my life in the most moral way, but I have adopted these correct views, therefore I'm more righteous than you, right? There's this payoff in a sense. So I understand like why there's some draw to that as well.
Hmm.
I think having gone through that and also seeing like pragmatically how it works. Like you get hooked by this aha feeling. You get
Hmm.
hooked by this sense of moral and intellectual superiority. You get hooked by that, but then like it's just drags down your mental health. Like it just spirals out of control downward. And so you see that, and I'm like able to see that, like having come through that, I'm able to see that around me. And it's almost impossible to point that out to somebody who's currently in it
Hmm.
because it's like, well, you must be a representative, a stooge for the capitalist system, or a representative of systemic racism or the patriarchy. You're a white man, you don't know what you're talking about, right? There's no legitimate way that you can point this out to somebody who's in the middle of it. And actually, a lot
Hmm.
of social justice literature actually says this explicitly. There's no legitimate way to disagree with it, right?
Hmm.
So it's almost impossible. There has to be some kind of like emotional awakening before you can touch the intellect, I guess.
Mm-hmm. That special knowledge that often described as a precursor to kind of cult thought or group thought that,
Absolutely, yeah.
allows you to exclude any counter narrative or anything that even represents something that feels like it's morally uh, uh, misaligned with the group consensus. And it made me wonder a little bit there. Do you think that for folks that are going through an experience like that, and maybe you can kind of reflect on your own experience here, is there a certain amount of explanatory power and certainty initially involved in that? That, I think of certainty as kind of often feeling like even if it's not actually certainty, but the sense of certainty being almost what feels like the relief for anxiety, let's just say, the relief for fear, the relief for many negative affect emotions. And if somebody were to challenge or to bring in something new at that time when you were kind of taking in this information to you, how do you think you would have responded in hindsight?
Well, a lot of people challenged me, and
Mm,
I was very, I'm embarrassed at the kind of person that I was. I was just a
mm,
jerk to people, like you don't know you're a racist, white supremacist, like, whatever. I used all the things that people now call me. I was calling other people, so maybe it's karma. I don't know. Um, but I was not open to it at all. I was like a mean person to people who disagree with me. And I'm embarrassed to say that. Like I wish I had responded more maturely, but I didn't. I was devoted to this. This is essentially the holy and sacred religion. Um, and yeah, I think one of the things that got me, there was a lot of intellectual arguments that worked on me, but none of those would have had a chance if it weren't for the cumulative effect over the years of watching how people treated me. You know,
mm,
there was there'd be social justice activists on my own side. I would say something slightly off. I'd say something about Marx instead of about intersectionality. Shut the F up, you effing white man. I'm like, I so desperately wanted these people to be my friends and they hated me.
mm,
And conservatives, I would just spew venom at them. And they'd be like,
mm,
well, sorry you feel that way. Maybe I can buy you a cup of coffee sometime, change your mind. They're showing me kindness when
mm,
I'm
mm,
spewing venom, and these other people, I'm trying to be their friends and they hate me. And so that kind of emotional cue of who's treating me a certain way made me open to certain intellectual arguments. I would read
mm.
people like Thomas Sowell after that and kind of more absorbing kind of this different messaging.
To your
Yeah.
point before, running into the brick wall, running into that dissonance there of like, okay, something is not aligning here, and almost sounds like this maybe evolution of some doubt, some concern, and questioning, self-reflection of like, what is actually going on here? How do I make sense
Yeah.
out of this?
Yeah, I
Hmm.
think there's a certain cognitive dissonance that come from if you're screaming at someone saying you're intolerant, you have to eventually process that.
Yeah, and isn't it also true that, the way we understand our psychological maturity is oftentimes seen in the ability to bear the ambivalence, the ability
Mm,
to bear doubt and to think about, as opposed to terminating thinking with these cliches that are easily thrown about. And just because some belief makes you feel better doesn't mean that it's necessarily true. There are many
mhm,
beliefs that are obviously false, but if you endorse them, that they would make you feel much better. Magical beliefs tend to have that effect on people. But it is precisely some of these uncertainties that we need to bear that not only leads to our greater psychological maturity, but it also testifies to our orientation to treating complex reality with the nuance it deserves. Yeah,
Speaking to that ability to be adaptive and
yeah,
flexible in your life, absolutely.
yeah.
Hmm.
I want to ask you just one or two more questions. What do you see, maybe just personally, what are your plans going forward, Ryan? I know you've published a book. Maybe you can speak about the book. The Woke Mind is there in the background.
Yeah.
Looks quite interesting. Maybe just tell us a bit about your future prospects, your plans. Tell us a bit
Well,
more about that.
we talked a little bit about some of the themes earlier, but it's essentially how the philosophy and ideology around social justice thinking leads to what looks very much like mental illness. And I kind of explained the history of why this came about. So in mid 20th century in America and the West, you had Marxists who had been promising us for 100 years that the great solution was to overthrow the capitalist system and implement socialism and then communism, and then we would have utopia, we would cure poverty, everything would be good, oppression would be over. And the 20th century showed us that the exact opposite was the case. Capitalism was lifting people out of poverty like crazy. People were just, shooting up in terms of economic mobility. And in socialist societies or communist societies, people are being impoverished, they're being oppressed. They're the greatest human rights catastrophes the world has ever known.
Without exception.
Yes. To highlight on that, if you look at all fascist and Nazi regimes combined, the communists killed about 2.5 times that much.
Yes.
Like it is far and away the greatest human rights catastrophe ever. And so if you're a Marxist, there were some Marxists who left the faith and became liberals or conservatives. But a lot of these Marxists, they had to figure out a strategy. And so what you hear is the cultural turn. So that's critical theory coming out of Germany and postmodernism coming out of France.
Very good.
And one of the things, you had people like Deleuze and Guattari in France who had this idea that people having a healthy psyche is actually maladaptive because the response that you should have to a capitalist system is psychosis.
Yes, schizophrenia.
Yes.
Schizoanalysis.
Schizoanalysis, yes. So they, the point of their politics and their psychoanalysis is pushing people towards psychosis, not towards well-being, right?
Anti-Oedipus.
Anti-Oedipus, yes. So you have Herbert Marcuse in the U.S. Well, actually, going back to Marx said, you get your ideas through by the ruthless criticism of all that exists. Never have gratitude, never be grateful for what you have, right? Always be criticizing. That's how you push socialism forward. And Marcuse had this concept called the power of negative thinking. Again, Marcuse was one of the most fascinating thinkers to me because he's one of the things in the book, One Dimensional Man, one of the things he's constantly criticizing, he's so angry that America is so prosperous, right? He's angry that people can afford their own home and their own car and their own color television set. He's like, he's kind of thinking out loud. He's like, no one wants to be a Marxist anymore, and he's like, can you even push for a revolution if no one wants one? He's kind of confused by this. And his answer is never have gratitude, always see the negatives in life. Nowadays, we would say always look for things that are problematic, right? And then, kind of with those, the French postmodernists and the German critical theorists, you pair those, or I would say you have those hiding behind identity politics. So with critical theory, you hide it behind race and you call it critical race theory, right?
Yeah.
And, what happens when you have people, when you push this idea on people, you have what often looks like cluster B personality disorders, especially borderline personality disorder. And so if you look on a lot of college campuses, and there's tons of examples that I give in the book, but the best one is some speaker like Ben Shapiro comes to campus and students are having a meltdown. They're saying, I am in danger. I don't feel safe, right? Your language is violence. This is a very borderline type response, and it didn't come out of a vacuum. It didn't come out of TikTok. It comes out of this social justice ideology rooted in critical theory and postmodernism. And when you look at how that ideology manifests, and you look at 2020 cities burning down, or if you look at gender affirming care where we're mutilating mentally ill kids, like if you look at the effect of this, it's predictable based on where these ideas came from.
Yeah. Where can people reach you?
I'm on X at Ryan McRogers.
Right.
And that's the main place that I post.
Excellent. Ryan, thank you very much. This was such a nice discussion. Thank you very much. Keep us updated on the progress. Keep us updated on how your studies and your practicals will be going, and maybe we can do this sometime again.
I'd love to.
Right. Look after yourself now.
Thank you.